On the night of July 3, 1954, in a quiet lakeside home in Bay Village, Ohio, a pregnant woman was beaten to death in her own bedroom while her husband slept on the couch downstairs. By morning, her husband had called for help. By afternoon, the police were treating him as their primary suspect. By the end of the summer, the entire country had already decided he was guilty. And by the end of the year, a jury agreed. His name was Dr. Sam Sheppard. He was 30 years old, well-liked in his community, and a respected osteopathic surgeon at a local hospital. He told police that a bushy-haired stranger had broken into the house, attacked his wife, fought with him when he tried to intervene, and escaped into the night. He had a dislocated vertebra in his neck. He had bruising across his body and a chipped tooth. He had injuries that were real and documented and that any fair investigation would have taken seriously from the very beginning. The police did not take them seriously. What followed the murder of Marilyn Sheppard was one of the most consequential criminal cases in the entire history of the American justice system. Not because of what happened in that bedroom on the night of July 3, but because of what happened afterward. In the courtroom, in the newspapers, and eventually on the steps of the Supreme Court of the United States, a decade later, where the case arrived not as a story about a murder, but as a fundamental question about whether a fair trial in America was even possible anymore when the press had already decided the answer. Before we go into this story, let us know where you are watching from. And if you want more cases like this, subscribe, because the truth that eventually emerged about what happened in Bay Village that night took 4 decades to surface, and when it finally did, it pointed somewhere that the original investigation had never once looked. To understand the Sheppard case, you need to understand Bay Village, Ohio in 1954. Not just as a place, but as a particular state of mind that shaped everything that came after. Bay Village is a small, affluent suburb on the southern shore of Lake Erie, 12 miles west of Cleveland. In the summer of 1954, it was the kind of community where neighbors knew each other by name, where doors were left unlocked in the evenings, where children moved freely between houses without adults worrying about where they had gone. It was, in the language of the era, a good neighborhood. A safe neighborhood. The kind of place where violent crime was not supposed to happen, and where the intrusion of violent crime therefore carried an additional layer of shock and disorientation that made calm, methodical investigation harder from the very first moment. The Sheppard family was deeply rooted in Bay Village. Dr. Sam Sheppard and his 2 brothers were all osteopathic surgeons who worked at their family's Bay View Hospital nearby. The hospital had been founded by their father, Dr. Richard Allen Sheppard, who was himself a prominent figure in the community. Sam was the youngest of the 3 brothers, 30 years old in the summer of 1954, athletic and physically striking, known around the community for his work at the hospital and for the easy, approachable manner that made patients and colleagues alike regard him warmly. His wife Marilyn was 29 years old and 4 months pregnant with their second child. By every account from people who knew her, she was a warm, intelligent, socially engaged woman who had built genuine friendships throughout Bay Village and who was, in the most straightforward sense of the phrase, beloved by the people in her life. They had a 7-year-old son named Chip, and they lived in a comfortable house on Lake Road, right on the shore of Lake Erie, with a private beach that ran down to the water behind the house. On the evening of July 3, 1954, the Sheppards had neighbors over for dinner. Don and Nancy Ahern spent the evening at the house. The 4 of them ate together, talked, and spent the kind of easy summer evening that felt entirely ordinary in every way. By the time the Aherns left, sometime around midnight, Sam had fallen asleep on the downstairs couch with the television still on. Marilyn went upstairs to bed. The house settled into the particular quiet of a summer night on a lake, the water moving outside, the neighborhood still. What happened next, in the early hours of July 4, 1954, is what has been argued, reconstructed, investigated, and debated for 70 years without ever being fully resolved to everyone's satisfaction. What Sam Sheppard told police was this. He was awakened from the couch by Marilyn calling his name. He ran upstairs and in the dim light encountered a figure in the bedroom, large, with bushy hair, standing near the bed where Marilyn lay. He struggled with the figure. He was struck hard and lost consciousness. When he came around, Marilyn was in the bed, motionless. He checked her and understood immediately that she was dead. He then heard or sensed movement downstairs and pursued a figure outside, down through the back of the house and onto the beach behind it. He struggled with the figure again at the water's edge and was rendered unconscious a second time. When he regained consciousness, he was lying face down on the beach, his feet in the shallow water of Lake Erie, the early light of the 4th of July morning beginning to show over the water. He went back inside. He called a neighbor, Spencer Houck, who was both a friend and the mayor of Bay Village. Houck called the police. Marilyn Sheppard had been struck at least 27 times. The weapon was never found. The injuries to her face and head indicated a sustained, frenzied attack, not a single blow in a struggle but a prolonged assault that continued long past anything necessary. She was 4 months pregnant. The bedroom was heavily blood-stained. Sam had injuries consistent with a physical struggle, the dislocated neck vertebra, the bruising, the chipped tooth. And there was one piece of physical evidence discovered in that house on the morning of July 4, 1954, that would become critically important decades later, though it received very little serious attention at the time. A blood trail. A series of drops leading from the upstairs bedroom, down the stairs, and out of the house. Blood that had been typed and found to be neither Marilyn Sheppard's blood type nor Sam Sheppard's blood type. Blood from a third person, an unidentified third person, present in that house on the night of the murder. In 1954, forensic technology could not fully analyze that blood trail beyond basic blood typing. So investigators noted it, documented it, and then largely set it aside. Because by the time that blood trail had been fully documented, the investigation had already chosen its direction. And the direction it had chosen was Sam Sheppard. The investigation that followed the murder was shaped less by the evidence and more by the atmosphere surrounding it. The Bay Village Police Chief, John Eaton, knew the Sheppard family personally, which created an awkwardness in the early hours that led to decisions that a more experienced homicide unit operating under cleaner conditions would not have made. The crime scene was not secured with the speed and strictness that a murder investigation required. Friends and neighbors were allowed into the house in the early morning hours, before the evidence had been fully documented and photographed. These early failures in evidence preservation would create problems for investigators and defense attorneys alike for decades to come. But it was not the police investigation that truly defined the public understanding of what had happened in the Sheppard house on Lake Road. It was the newspapers. The Cleveland Press was the dominant afternoon newspaper in the city, and its editor, Louis Seltzer, was one of the most powerful figures in Cleveland media in 1954. Seltzer had decided early, and apparently without much internal conflict, that Sam Sheppard was guilty and that the local authorities were protecting him because of his family's money and their connections in Bay Village and Cleveland. The press began running front-page editorials that were not coverage of the story but verdicts on it. The headlines were not questions. They were instructions. Why isn't Sam Sheppard in jail? Quit stalling and bring him in. The name of a specific detective was published with the suggestion that his failure to arrest Sheppard was suspicious. The editorials were read by virtually everyone in Cuyahoga County, the county from which the jury that would eventually decide Sam Sheppard's fate would be drawn. Sam Sheppard was arrested on July 30, 1954, less than 4 weeks after the murder. His trial began in October 1954 in a Cleveland courtroom that had been transformed, from its opening day, into something closer to a public spectacle than a proceeding of law. Reporters filled every available seat. Camera flashbulbs went off throughout testimony. The names and home addresses of all 12 jurors were published in the newspapers during the trial itself, which meant that every juror was identifiable, reachable, and exposed to any public pressure that anyone wished to apply. The judge, Edward Blythin, was simultaneously running for re-election to the Cleveland Municipal Court, which gave him a personal and professional reason to avoid making any decision that might be characterized as soft on a defendant that the city's most powerful newspaper had already declared guilty. Years after the trial concluded, a prominent journalist named Dorothy Kilgallen, who had covered the proceedings for a national wire service, revealed publicly that Judge Blythin had spoken to her privately during the trial and told her that Sam Sheppard was guilty as hell. The judge had told a journalist covering the case that the defendant was guilty while the trial was still ongoing, before the jury had delivered its verdict, before the defense had completed its case. The trial was still in session. The verdict had not yet been reached, and the man presiding over it had already decided. On December 21, 1954, After 5 days of deliberation, the jury found Sam Sheppard guilty of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison at the Ohio State Penitentiary. He maintained his innocence from the first day of his arrest to the last day of his life. Sam Sheppard served 10 years in the Ohio State Penitentiary. He lost his medical license. His son Chip, 7 years old when his mother was murdered and his father was arrested, grew up making visits to a prison. 1 month after the guilty verdict was delivered, Sam's mother took her own life. 11 days after that, his father died. The family that had built Bayview Hospital and established the Sheppard name in Bay Village was effectively gone within weeks of the conviction. While Sam Sheppard was in prison, a young attorney named F. Lee Bailey took on his case. Bailey was ambitious, sharp, and possessed of an absolute conviction that Sam Sheppard had been denied a fair trial. He was not primarily arguing innocence, though he believed in it. He was arguing process. He was arguing that what had happened in that Cleveland courtroom in 1954 was not a trial at all by any meaningful constitutional standard, but a performance conducted in front of cameras and reporters while the real verdict was being delivered in the newspapers every morning. Those arguments went all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States. In 1966, in a decision that became a landmark of American constitutional law, the Supreme Court ruled 8-1 in Sam Sheppard's favor. The majority opinion, written by Justice Tom Clark, held that the trial had been conducted in a carnival atmosphere of media excess that had made a genuinely fair verdict impossible. The court identified the newspaper coverage, the courtroom chaos, the published juror addresses, the failure of the trial judge to sequester the jury or control the proceedings, and the overall abdication of judicial responsibility to protect the integrity of the process as a collective constitutional violation that could not stand. The Sheppard decision established principles about trial management and press interference that American courts still apply today. It is studied in law schools. It is cited in courtrooms. It changed, in a direct and permanent way, how high-profile criminal trials are conducted in the United States. Sam Sheppard walked out of prison in 1966. He had served 10 years. He was retried later that same year, with F. Lee Bailey defending him before a new jury. The jury acquitted him in less than 12 hours. Sam Sheppard was officially not guilty. He was a free man. But freedom, arriving after 10 years of incarceration and the public destruction of everything he had built, is not the same thing as restoration. He attempted to resume medical practice with limited success. He remarried twice. He struggled with the weight of what had been taken from him in ways that the acquittal could not fix, because the acquittal could give him back his legal standing but it could not give back the decade, or his parents, or the version of his life that would have existed if the investigation had followed the evidence rather than the newspaper headlines. Sam Sheppard died in 1970. He was 4 to 6 years old. But the story did not end there. In the 1990s, Sam's son Chip, now an adult who had spent most of his life in the shadow of this case, hired a private investigator to do what the original 1954 investigation had never done. To look at all of the physical evidence. To follow it without a predetermined conclusion. To ask the question that should have been asked from the beginning, which was not whether Sam Sheppard was guilty, but who actually killed Marilyn Sheppard. That investigation pointed to a man named Richard Eberling. Eberling was a window washer who had worked at the Sheppard home in the period before the murder. He had been inside the house. He knew the layout. He had access. In 1959, 5 years after Marilyn's death, Eberling was arrested on a theft charge. During that investigation, he voluntarily told police that he had cut himself while working at the Sheppard residence and had bled inside the home. His blood type was consistent with the unidentified blood found in the Sheppard house on the night of the murder. The blood in the trail. The blood that was neither Marilyn's nor Sam's. The blood from the third person that the 1954 investigation had noted and then set aside. Richard Eberling was, by the time of Chip Sheppard's renewed investigation in the 1990s, already serving a life sentence at the Marion Correctional Institution in Ohio. He had been convicted of the murder of an elderly woman named Ethel Dakin in 1984. Dakin had been a wealthy widow whose estate Eberling had systematically manipulated over a period of years, inserting himself into her life, becoming her trusted caretaker, and eventually making himself a significant beneficiary of her will. When she died under circumstances that raised questions, investigation revealed the extent of his manipulation. He was convicted of her murder and sentenced to life. When investigators looking at the Sheppard case examined Eberling's broader history, they found connections to the suspicious deaths of multiple other elderly women over the years, deaths that had been recorded as accidents or natural causes but that, viewed together against the background of what was known about Eberling, began to suggest a pattern of a man who used proximity and trust as tools and who had been operating in this way for a very long time. When investigators confronted Richard Eberling directly about Marilyn Sheppard's murder, his responses were not those of a man with nothing to hide. He was evasive. He was inconsistent. He hinted, at different times and in different conversations, that he knew more about what had happened in the Sheppard house than he had ever said publicly. He never fully confessed. He never provided a clean account that could be tested against the evidence. Before the investigation into his potential role in Marilyn's murder could be fully developed, Richard Eberling died in prison in 1998. Chip Sheppard filed a civil lawsuit in 1999 seeking a formal legal declaration of his father's innocence and damages from the state of Ohio for Sam's wrongful imprisonment. The civil trial produced significant new evidence. DNA testing conducted on biological material from the original 1954 crime scene, using technology that had not existed when the murder occurred, identified a DNA profile that did not match Sam Sheppard. The profile was consistent with Richard Eberling. The civil jury ruled against Chip Sheppard. Not because the evidence pointed to Sam's guilt. The jury did not believe Sam was guilty. They ruled against the claim because the legal standard required a level of proof that 4 to 5 years, degraded evidence, and the deaths of key witnesses made impossible to fully assemble. The case was not won. But what it produced, publicly and in the legal record, was a body of evidence pointing away from Sam Sheppard and toward a man who had been in that house, whose blood type matched the unidentified blood from the crime scene, whose DNA was consistent with biological material found there, and who had spent the rest of his life committing crimes of manipulation and violence against the people who trusted him. Sam Sheppard was never officially exonerated. He remains, in the legal record, an acquitted man. Not guilty, but never formally declared innocent. His family has carried that distinction for 70 years. The Sheppard case leaves 3 things that cannot be set aside. The first is about what happens when the media becomes the jury. Louis Seltzer and the Cleveland Press did not cover the Sheppard case. They prosecuted it. They ran front-page editorials demanding arrest and conviction before a verdict had been reached. They published information that inflamed public opinion in a county whose residents would sit in judgment of the accused. They treated guilt as established fact while the investigation was still ongoing. The Supreme Court eventually recognized this for what it was, a fundamental corruption of the process that the Constitution requires. But that recognition came 10 years too late for Sam Sheppard, who had already lost a decade of his life, his parents, his career, and his health to a verdict that was delivered in a newspaper before it was delivered in a courtroom. The mechanism that destroyed Sam Sheppard in 1954 has not gone away. It has only changed its format. The second is about the evidence that was present from the beginning and ignored because it complicated the story that had already been chosen. The unidentified blood in the Sheppard house was documented in 1954. It was typed. It was noted in police records. And then it was functionally set aside because the investigation had already decided who the killer was and was engaged in building the case to fit that decision rather than following the evidence to wherever it actually led. Richard Eberling's blood type matched that unidentified blood. He had been in the house. He had admitted bleeding there 5 years after the murder, to police conducting an unrelated investigation. The connection was not hidden. It was available. It required only an investigation that was genuinely looking for the truth rather than one that had already found a target. The third is about the full weight of what a wrongful conviction costs, measured not just in years but in everything that surrounds them. Sam Sheppard lost 10 years in prison. He lost both of his parents in the weeks following the verdict. He lost his career, his reputation, and the version of his life that would have existed without all of this. His son Chip lost a father during the years when having a father matters most, and spent his adult life pursuing a justice that the legal system ultimately refused to formally deliver. And Marilyn Sheppard, the woman who was actually murdered, the 29-year-old pregnant woman who was beaten to death in her bedroom on a summer night, had her case effectively closed the moment investigators stopped looking for the real killer. If Richard Eberlein killed Marilyn Sheppard, and the evidence that has emerged over decades suggests strongly that he did, then he killed her knowing that someone else was almost certainly going to be blamed. And the system that existed to find the truth handed him precisely the outcome he needed to walk away free. Marilyn Sheppard was 29 years old on the night of July 3, 1954. She was 4 months pregnant. She had a 7-year-old son asleep in the house. She had spent the evening with friends and neighbors in the easy warmth of an early summer night. She deserved an investigation that was actually looking for the person who killed her. She never got one. Sam Sheppard spent 10 years in prison for her murder. He was acquitted. He died at 46, still carrying the weight of what had been done to him, without ever being fully and formally believed. Richard Eberlein died in prison in 1998, convicted of a different murder, never charged with Marilyn's, never required to answer in a courtroom for what the evidence suggests he did in Bay Village on the night of July 3, 1954. The case that produced landmark Supreme Court protections for every defendant in this country. The case that changed how trials are conducted. The case that inspired a television series and a film seen by millions of people. At its foundation, it is the story of a woman who was murdered and a system that spent 10 years punishing the wrong man for it while the right one went free. If you have watched this far, leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from.